Okay, great. Well, thank you, Lindsay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our third webinar of the winter series. Today, we have the talk titled Building the Bajo Bayano, Raised Field Agriculture and Early Complex Society Developments in Eastern Panama by Dr. Adam Berrey, who will be presenting about his research in Panama. And so before we get started, while we meet in a virtual platform, we would like to acknowledge the importance of the land which we all call home, from coast to coast. We respectfully acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. We would also like to let you know that our next webinar in April will feature the researcher Carito Medina, who will discuss their archaeological project in Peru titled Hacia una arqueología de alimentación, una propuesta teórica metodológica desde el Programa Arqueológico Chicama. So please mark that on your calendars. Hola a todos, bienvenidos al tercer webinar de nuestra serie seminaria este invierno 2023. Hoy día tenemos la presentación titulada Building Bajo Bayano, Raised Field Agriculture and Early Complex Society Development in Eastern Panama, a cargo del Dr. Adam Berrey, quien nos contará sus investigaciones en Panamá. Antes de comenzar, mientras que ven unidos los participantes a la reunión virtual, nos gustaría reconocer la importancia de la tierra de cada uno consideramos y llamamos hogar. De costa a costa reconocemos con humildad y agradecimiento del territorio ancestral y eterno perteneciente al pueblo Inuit, Métis y Primeras Naciones, cuyo hogar es esta tierra. También informarlos que en nuestro próximo seminario web, que será en abril, tendremos la investigadora Carito Medina, quien nos hablará sobre su proyecto titulada Hacia una arqueología de la alimentación, una propuesta teórico-metodológica desde el Programa Arqueológico Chicama. No nos olvidan. Ahora le paso a la palabra a Patricia, quien presentará a nuestro invitado.
Thank you, Alexa. Thank you, Adam, for being here. Adam Berrey is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at California State University, Sacramento, and is the director, principal investigator of the Proyecto Arqueológico Bajo Bayano. He received his PhD in anthropology from the University of Pittsburgh in 2014, and from 2017 to 2021 was a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Anthropology at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. His research focuses on understanding the variable nature of early complex society development, particularly as it relates to the interplay between demography, political, and economic processes. He specialized in the archaeology of the Istmo Colombian area and conducts field research in Central and Eastern Panama.
Okay, does that go to me, Patricia?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
For you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. Gracias a todos y muy buenas tardes. I will be continuing on from here in English, but I would be happy to field any questions at the end in Spanish if that suits people. And I will bring up the presentation here. All right, are people seeing the presentation?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So I'd like to start off by thanking Patricia and the rest of the Canadian Latin American Archaeology Society for the opportunity to speak today. This is going to be what amounts to really our first real attempt to start disseminating some of the early results that are emerging from our project. We've communicated some of the objectives previously in conferences in Panama, but this is the first talk to be given at the stage where we actually have some results to discuss. And so before we get started, I would like to recognize the vital role played by some of the key team members of this project: Ani Lopez, Sergio Castro, Julian Escobar, and Yusette Boritica. These individuals have played a vital role in the success of this research, and without their dedication, their sacrifice, and their talents, what I will be talking about today will not be possible. So everything that is discussed in this talk is very much attributable to their efforts as much as they are to mine. So what we are looking here in this image is a photo of the Lower Bayano Valley. Out in the distance, you can see the Pacific Ocean. In roughly the middle range part of the photo, you can see some low-lying coastal plains that extend back from the coast about 1 kilometer or 2 before the land starts to rise into the upland zones. And what you can't see in this photo, but what is present, is what has called our attention to this region, located there where the red arrow is. And that is the system of raised agricultural fields that you can see in the satellite imagery from Google Earth. Here are some images of that same raised field system taken from ground level. These fields take on what I consider kind of a very traditional form of raised fields, although there's lots of variability throughout the Americas in the form that these fields can take. These are very linear sets of ridges and canals that lie parallel to one another, and different sets sometimes at perpendicular angles. But here is where the Rio Bayano Valley and the site of Chinina specifically is located in the Panamanian Isthmus, and in relation to some other important archaeological sites that are well known for pre-Hispanic Panama. Now, the Rio Bayano Valley and the site of Chinina itself lie in what is traditionally considered to be a different sociocultural interaction sphere in Eastern Panama than is what is thought to have existed in the central part of the isthmus. This distinction between Gran Cocle in the central part of Panama and Gran Darien in the eastern part is based largely on ceramic styles, and while not without its problems that have been discussed by many of my colleagues in Panama before, they provide useful approximations for spheres of interaction across which certain cultural traits seem to be shared on some level. So here we're looking at an inset that shows where the site of Chinina is located in the context of the Lower Bayano Valley. You can see the Rio Bayano itself located over on the left side of that larger image to the left, the Pacific coastline down in the bottom of that image. This system of raised fields at Chinina was initially excavated by Juan Guillermo Martin of the Universidad del Norte in Barranquilla, Colombia, and some of his colleagues. And since that initial research and publication in 2015, Google Earth has published new satellite imagery that reveals additional landscape modifications at the site of Chinina, which you can see somewhat in this upper right-hand photo. You can see a series of kind of square platforms encompassed by canals. These modifications sit directly south of the raised field system that we saw in the previous photo. So if you can see my cursor here, this fence line that my cursor is dragging along right here, that you can see just barely in this photo right here, is this fence line right here in this image. And so these modifications, you can see this image, extend from that more kind of linear system of perpendicular ridges and canals down almost to the coast itself. In this more recent satellite imagery, we can also identify additional modifications at other localities in the raised field or in the Lower Bayano Valley that had not been previously documented. These modifications that we see here in the upper right-hand corner occur at a locality known as Pi, which sit just at the base of those upland hills on the other side of the mangrove swamp. And additional modifications can be seen at the locality known as Corozal. This is the locality that sits closest to the Rio Bayano. And so raised field systems like this are by no means unique in the context of the pre-Hispanic Americas. Numerous raised field systems have been documented in region and are very well studied in numerous regions of the Americas, like the Guayas Basin of Ecuador, like the Llanos de Mojos of Bolivia, like the Depresión Momposina of Colombia, like the Western Venezuelan Llanos, and many, many others. They do become a bit more interesting to think about in the context of Southern Central America. To the best of my knowledge, the raised field systems that exist in the Lower Bayano Valley are the only known examples of such fields anywhere in Southern Central America south of the Maya area. So it does raise some interesting questions as to why these fields were built. And this, of course, is the question that has driven a lot of research into regions where raised field agriculture has been documented in the pre-Hispanic era. And these three questions that you see on the screen here are essentially our research questions in a nutshell, a very kind of broad and generalized version of those questions. We want to understand when and why were raised fields built in the Lower Bayano Valley, for how long were they in use, and what implications did they have, if any, for early complex society development. So what other changes might we document in the trajectory of early complex society development in this region that perhaps resulted as a consequence of the development of raised field agriculture and other changes that it brought about. So this question of why were raised fields built is, or has traditionally been approached from one of two perspectives. This question is often addressed from either a top-down or what is often referred to as a top-down perspective, which sees raised field agriculture as the product of sociopolitical ambitions, the result of a grand or aspiring elites who seek to produce an agricultural surplus to support their political ambitions and support a burgeoning political economy. On the other perspective, on the other side of this, are bottom-up perspectives that see the emergence of raised field agriculture largely as the product of independent decisions made by autonomous households and local communities seeking either to bolster their domestic economies or simply meet their subsistence needs, but in the absence of strong sociopolitical control. Now, as John Janusek and Alan Colada have previously discussed, and as many other authors have also recognized, this particular framework has created somewhat of a false dichotomy. And different authors have taken up different issues with this particular framework. But for me, it masks two important realms of variation. When we tend to think of the emergence of raised field agriculture as simply a top-down or bottom-up process, it creates a dichotomy or a presence-absence situation out of something that we should consider more as a continuous axis of variation. That is, we tend to think of, according to this framework, it essentially forces us to think of sociopolitical control over raised field agriculture as something that is either present or absent, when in fact, there can be differing degrees of sociopolitical control over agricultural production. There can be a lot of control involved, maybe moderate amounts of control involved, maybe very little, but some control involved, or no control at all. And I think there's some evidence in the archaeology of different regions where raised fields have been constructed that allow us to begin to elucidate some of this variation. There are regions where I think we can say there was a lot of control involved here, other regions where we can say there was some control involved here, but maybe not. And so I think this is one of the aspects of variation that this dichotomous framework tends to mask. What it also tends to mask is the considerable variation in the true motives that spurred raised field agriculture to begin with. In this dichotomous framework of top-down versus bottom-up, the motivation becomes political or non-political. When in fact, the motivations for pursuing raised field agriculture are much more variable than that. If it is spurred for political motivations, for instance, was the surplus that was thought to be produced to be used for exchange? Was it to be used for feasting ceremonies and other types of activities? Was it to be used for sustaining large labor pools in the construction of large public monuments? Was it to be used for sustaining warriors and perhaps refugees in times of conflict? Or if there was little sociopolitical control involved, was it because of environmental conditions that households tended to pursue raised field agriculture? Was it because of demographic pressure, which has also been attributed to the development of raised field agriculture by many archaeologists? And again, these are aspects of the variability in the motivations of raised field agriculture that is masked by this dichotomous framework. And so while this framework has helped us out a lot in recognizing that there is variation in the degree of sociopolitical control that is involved in raised field agriculture, we also need to begin moving beyond this dichotomy and thinking about these issues along more continuous or at least more categorical scales. So if in the Rio Bayano Valley, raised field agriculture does wind up having been a product of some degree of sociopolitical control, then this would be a particularly interesting scenario in the context of pre-Hispanic Panama. For all we know about the basis of social power of chieftains in pre-Hispanic Panama, it is consistently thought on the basis of both ethnohistoric and archaeological evidence that the control of subsistence production was not an important kind of ingredient in constructing those power bases. In both ethnohistoric documents and in the archaeological record of central Panama, at least, which is where the vast majority of archaeological research has been focused in pre-Hispanic Panama, at least when compared to the eastern part of the isthmus, we see the recurring importance of activities such as elaborate funerary rituals, warfare, craft specialization, and interregional exchange. These seem to have been some of the key ingredients that in different regions of pre-Hispanic Panama and during the 16th century gave rise to social power in these pre-Hispanic chiefdoms. Now, this isn't to say that these different activities all played the same role in different regions of pre-Hispanic Panama, or even to say that they were all vitally important. But we do see in recurring circumstances, these same ingredients tend to kind of pop up as being important in constructing social power in these early complex societies of pre-Hispanic and 16th century Panama. So one important thing to consider in this context is the really diverse forms that these field systems seem to have taken in the Rio Bayano Valley. The argument has been set forth that if raised field agriculture was the product of, or if political control was involved in raised field agriculture, then because of the planning involved in that, we should expect to see some degree of kind of formal structures. We would expect more consistency in the form of raised fields than we see in the raised field systems of the Bajo Bayano Valley. So this tells us, based on this line of evidence alone, this might suggest that raised field agriculture in this region was more of a bottom-up process by independent households and communities kind of making their own decisions about how to construct raised fields and how to cultivate their crops, or it could also indicate levels of political control that were local to each locality in the region, whereas essentially each elite, if there were elites involved, were calling their own shots at each locality. Another important factor to consider is just the sheer area across which these raised fields and landscape modifications exist. So what we see here in the polygons in this map are essentially these are not just the areas across which raised fields and other landscape modifications can be identified in Lower Bayano Valley, but these polygons encompass what is essentially the largest possible area across which those modifications could be constructed. These are the areas of the low-lying coastal plains in the Bajo Bayano Valley. And so even if we take this as kind of a maximal estimate of the area across which raised fields and other landscape modifications might have been built, this still falls well short of the area across which raised fields were constructed in other parts of the pre-Hispanic Americas, notably in South America. These areas here in the Lower Bayano Valley amount to less than 9 square kilometers. And when we put this up against regions like the Depresión Momposina in Colombia, or the Titicaca Basin on the Peruvian and Colombian border, where over approximately 1,000 square kilometers of raised fields were constructed, we see a very stark contrast. And I think this is an important factor to keep in mind as we continue to evaluate this issue of just how much sociopolitical control, if any, might have been involved in raised field agriculture. Because if this was an issue of environmental circumstances, and indeed in these low-lying coastal plains, raised field agriculture really probably is the most viable option for cultivation, it begs the question, well, why were people living in these low-lying coastal plains to begin with when there was ample land at higher elevations directly adjacent to these coastal plains? And that's what you see in the vast majority of these photos up in kind of the upper right-hand image of or corner of that image. So if this was a bottom-up endeavor, then why were people choosing to live there in the first place when there was seemingly ample land elsewhere that did not require modification to either live or to cultivate your fields? So the work done by Juan Martin and his colleagues produced some very interesting observations, one of which has to do with the timing of when these fields seem to have been built. Juan Martin and his team excavated a trench across one of the ridges, the agricultural ridges at Chinina, at the base of which they recovered a charcoal encrusted sherd that has been radiocarbon dated to 650 to 710 CE. And they interpret this as essentially the initial construction date of raised fields at Chinina. Now, whether this date applies to all of the landscape modifications that have since been identified in the Lower Bayano Valley is a different question, but this date does pose some very interesting considerations given what we know about pre-Hispanic Panama in this particular time period. So although we're accustomed to thinking about Eastern Panama and Central Panama as representing kind of two different sociocultural interaction spheres, this distinction really seems to have emerged later on in the pre-Hispanic trajectory, especially after about AD 1000. Oops, excuse me. From AD 500 to 700, this boundary really seems to have disappeared. Juan Martin and Luis Sanchez have documented the distribution of Gran Cocle style of ceramic that corresponds to this period known as Cubita, which is distributed across this entire zone you see shaded in red here. And so this distinction between Gran Cocle and Gran Darien seems to have been much weaker during this period in time, if not just broken down completely, in this period of 500 to 700 CE, which corresponds to the proposed date for the initial construction of raised fields at Chinina. Now, the widespread presence of these Cubita style sherds in both central and eastern Panama is attributable, according to Juan Martin and Luis Sanchez, to exchange moving across the Pacific littoral there in what they have called the Mediterranean isthmus. And I think there's very little doubt that goods were moving across this Panama and Parita Bay at this time at relatively high rates when compared to other periods. And you can see by its geographic positioning, the Rio Bayano Valley would have been well situated to take advantage of some of that trade as it was moving across the Panama and Parita Bay. It lies directly north of the Pearl Islands, which is the archipelago you see there roughly in the middle of this image. And the Rio Bayano is one of two major waterways that lead inland into eastern Panama from the Pacific coast. So if you had goods moving across the Pacific Ocean or across the Pacific coast during this period of time, the Rio Bayano would have been a key inlet to move those goods further inland into eastern Panama. This time frame was also a period of major demographic, economic, and sociopolitical change in the context of pre-Hispanic Panama. It was during this time that regional polities began to emerge around the settlements of El Hatillo and Cerro Juan Diaz in the Rio Parita and Rio Levia valleys. This was a time of substantial population growth, at least in central Panama, where we have systematic regional surveys that allow us to assess that population growth. This was a period during which intense shell ornament production, which some have characterized as taking place under work-like shop conditions, developed at the site of Cerro Juan Diaz, presumably so as to produce goods that could be traded that in the exchange that was occurring across the Pacific at this time. And it's at this time that we begin to see the earliest indications of status distinctions emerge in pre-Hispanic Panama. We see these status distinctions begin to emerge at El Hatillo in the form of differential household artifact assemblages, at Cerro Juan Diaz in the form of differential mortuary treatment, and also at the site of Playa Venado in the form of differential mortuary treatment. And so the timing of what Juan Martin and his colleagues propose as the initial construction date of raised field agriculture in this region corresponds to a period of really profound political, economic, and demographic change in pre-Hispanic Panama. And so taking kind of the general notions of motivations for raised field agriculture from the types of top-down, bottom-up approaches that have been in the literature for a while now, coupled with some of the more contextual specific information we have for pre-Hispanic Panama at this time, we can home in some of our ideas and propose some of the possible following scenarios that might explain the conditions under which raised field agriculture developed. So it could have been that raised field agriculture was indeed taken on as a sociopolitical endeavor so as to produce surplus for aspiring elites, surplus that would likely have been used either for feasting, which is a well-documented activity in both the archaeological record and the ethnohistoric record of pre-Hispanic Panama, and in the exchange that was moving across the Pacific and certainly on via inland routes between AD 500 and 700. Now, surplus used to support monumental construction or warfare is not listed in this because in the Rio Bayano Valley, there is no evidence of monumental construction. There is no evidence to suggest that this would have been an activity for which elites would have been trying to garner surplus for. It's also curious that, I'll go back a couple of slides to this map, although we certainly can't remove the possibility that warfare was an important activity in the Rio Bayano Valley, just given how little we know, especially based on the archaeological information of Eastern Panama. It is curious that at the site of Miraflores, which is located about 15 kilometers further up the Rio Bayano, Richard Cook in the 1970s, excavated a series of about 3 tombs at the site, one of which at least shows grave assemblages comparable to some of the elite grave assemblages in the Rio Grande or in the Rio Preto Valley especially. But absent from these graves are any of the warrior iconography or weaponry that we're accustomed to seeing in some of these more elaborate tombs from sites like El Caño, Sitio Conte, and El Atillo. So based on this very limited line of evidence, this might suggest that warfare had a different role, potentially a less important role in this particular regional context, although that's a very speculative notion at this point. A second possibility is that race field agriculture in this region developed as a result of autonomous households seeking to bolster their domestic economy, be it to produce surplus that they could store for essentially future subsistence, or to take advantage of the trade that was moving across the Pacific at this time. In this sense, the development of race field agriculture in the Lower Bayano Valley may be somewhat akin to a situation that Alexander Martin has documented on the southern coast of Ecuador for the emergence of part-time specialization in spondylus shell ornament production. Alex has made the argument that in the southern coast of Manabí, households undertook part-time specialization in spondylus production so as to take advantage of trade that was occurring with Central Andean states. But this production was not overseen by any sort of, or not overseen by any strong political authority at least, and potentially very little political authority at all. This seems to have been an endeavor taken up by households of their own volition. And it could have been a similar situation in the Rio Bayano Valley, but instead of shell ornament production, it was race field agriculture as the economic activity that households sought to pursue so as to bolster their domestic economy. It is also possible that autonomous households undertook race field agriculture in this region simply to meet their basic subsistence needs. If this was the case, we might expect some level of population pressure in the higher elevations. Simply, that would have pushed populations into this low-lying land where modifying the landscape would have been essentially the only real option for cultivation. Or one possibility is, of course, none of the above. These are by no means the only possible scenarios under which race field agriculture could have emerged in this region, but they are perhaps some of the more probable ones, given what we know about the development of race field agriculture in other regions and the sociocultural context and kind of developmental context of pre-Hispanic Panama at this time. So our team, as part of the Proyecto Arqueológico Bajo Bayano, has set out to address some of these questions. And to do this, we started with a systematic regional survey that we carried out back in 2019. As part of this survey, we want to understand where people lived and carried out different activities in the Lower Bayano Valley, particularly in relation to the race field systems at Chinina, Pai, Corozal, and also Marchena. Marchena was another area where we do see landscape modifications. They were not shown in previous slides because they do not appear in satellite imagery, but if you go to this site, you can see what seem to be kind of ridges and canals at this location as well. We also want to use this information to make pre-Hispanic population estimates of this region, so we can make estimates of how many people lived in the Lower Bayano Valley and make assessments of whether that population was so large to think that maybe swidden agriculture would not have been enough to sustain it, thus possibly pushing them to pursue more intensive forms of agriculture. So these population estimates are needed to evaluate the possibility that race field agriculture was the product of demographic pressure. And then we also want to use this information to help understand, were all the landscape modifications that we see in the Lower Bayano Valley purely agricultural in nature, or did some of them serve a residential function as well? Up to this point, I've talked about them as being agriculture in nature, and I think in most instances that's the case, but as you'll see later on in this talk, there is an argument to be made that some of them served a residential function as well. And so, to carry out this systematic survey, because of the dense vegetation that exists in this region in the form of cattle pasture and grass, especially at the time of year that we are able to go down there, we have carried out this survey using shovel probes, which have been excavated systematically across all habitable areas of the landscape at intervals not exceeding 100 meters, so as to ensure a shovel probe measuring 40 by 40 centimeters was excavated in every hectare of habitable landscape. Here, you're looking at the distribution of our shovel probes at the locality of Corozal. You can see the landscape modifications, those kind of square platforms and the canals that surround them there in the background. The red dots in this map indicate negative shovel probes, or shovel probes that did not recover any pre-Hispanic artifacts. The white dots indicate positive shovel probes that did generate pre-Hispanic artifacts. These then became representations of the artifacts across individual collection lots, none of which exceed 1 hectare in area. And here in this part of the landscape, these collection lots were drawn essentially using Thiessen polygon techniques between adjacent shovel probes. In the uplands parts of or sectors of the region, these collection lots were drawn more in accordance with topography and natural geographic features that followed the contours of the landscape. So I'm not going to talk much more about the settlement methodology that has been used in this regional survey, but I will refer anyone who is interested to these 3 publications, which lay out some of the underlying principles in good detail that underlie this method of systematic survey, and also the principles underlying our demographic estimates. So here we are looking at all of the collection lots that have so far been documented in the Rio Bayano Valley. The yellow line represents our current survey boundary, where things stand right now. The white line up above that represents what we hope to achieve in the next season or 2, just so as to have a larger sample of this upland area so we can more accurately assess what's going on in that part of the region. You can't see it very clearly in this map, but the vast majority of this settlement is concentrated in these low-lying coastal plains. There is very little occupation, comparatively speaking, in the relatively small areas of uplands that we have documented so far. In this image right here, this is showing the distribution of shell middens that we documented during the course of regional survey, these red dots here. And what is interesting about this is this shows an overwhelming concentration of shell middens at the locality of Corozal. And while there are some shell middens elsewhere in the region, again, we see this overwhelming concentration at a single locality. And we do not think this is just an issue of preservation. There is nothing about the natural landscape or conditions in these different localities that would suggest preservation might be better at Corozal than in any of these other areas. We think, well, while we don't think we have documented every shell midden in the region necessarily, we do think that the patterning that is beginning to emerge is a real one based on where shells were processed in this region. So this is starting to generate some interesting questions of why these shell middens are concentrated at this one locality in Corozal. The red dots that you now see in this image, especially up in the uplands above the Pi locality, these are collection lots where only lithic materials were recovered. No ceramic sherds were recovered in these collection lots. And so if my recollection is correct, none of these collections contained finished tools. It was all flakes. And so this might suggest that some stages of lithic reduction were taking place in the uplands, and they were bringing back either kind of blanks or preforms or perhaps finished tools down to the lower elevations. It is worth noting, however, that we also do find evidence of stone tool production, flakes and whatnot, at these lower settlements as well. So it was not exclusively taking place in these upland zones, but some of the stages of lithic reduction seem to have been practiced in that area. Here we are looking at collection lots color-coded according to the density, the sherd density that was recovered from the shovel probe of each corresponding lot. And we can use this to help assess kind of the nature of some of these landscape modifications that we've seen up to this point. So here we're looking at the landscape modifications at Corozal again. Here is the distribution of shovel probes, and you can see how the positive shovel probes, again in white, really kind of skirt around that main area of landscape modification. And when we show the color-coded collection lots, we can see that the positive probes that did occur amidst these landscape modifications were all relatively low density, most of them below 10 sherds per square meter, some bumping up slightly larger than that, but on average, much lower densities in that area than the surrounding collection lots. And so at this point in time, this would seem to suggest that these modifications here were largely agricultural in nature, as opposed to serving as residential platforms. Here we are looking at the landscape modifications at the Pi locality, and here we see a different situation take place. Here we see collection lots really cover not the entirety, but a large section of these landscape modifications, and at relatively higher densities than what we saw at Corozal. And so one possibility is that these landscape modifications serve a residential function, but maybe also an agricultural one as well. These are the largest raised platforms anywhere in the Bayano Valley. And so these might have been platforms atop which individual families constructed their houses, but also maybe cultivated small sections of fields in this area as well, which would account for the low sherd densities and thus the presumably low residential densities that correspond to that. Okay, here we are looking at the raised fields at Chinina again. And again, here are the collection lots overlaid on top of that. The very distinct kind of parallel ridged and canal system that we see in the upper part of the image does have some sherds recovered from it, but again, at relatively low densities. It's unclear what the relation here might be, because these are not the types of ridges atop which you would think houses were built. These, just based on their form, seem to have been purely agriculture in nature. So the sherds might have been moved at some point and just through more recent human activity, or they could correspond to different periods during which maybe the raised fields were constructed at one period, and then later on in time, these areas were occupied by low density populations. That is something that has yet to be confirmed. One objective, or one part of this research that we hope to help evaluate this, is the mapping of these raised field systems using an aerial drone, along with excavations of these modifications themselves. So with this stage of research, among the questions we hope to address are, were all the landscape modifications of the Lower Bayano Valley, again, purely agriculture in nature, or were some residential? When were raised fields built, and for how long were they in use? And what kinds of crops were the raised fields used to cultivate? And across how large an area were raised fields built? So in this image, which was taken by Annie Lopez using an aerial drone, you can see pretty clearly the canals that exist along the perimeter of some relatively large platforms at the kind of southern edge of Chinina. Okay, and you can see one of our trench excavations there in the lower right-hand corner. Here's a zoomed in image of some of those excavations and the location of that trench in the context of the Chinina landscape. We also had excavated an additional trench, a 4x1 meter trench labeled CH1 in the image on the right, in the more traditional raised field system. I say traditional just because this is the shape of raised fields that I'm accustomed to thinking of. And we also excavated an additional 2x1 meter test pit in this system as well. And one of the objectives of these trenches and excavations was to recover soil samples so as to recover botanical samples. And these soil samples were submitted to Dolores Papirno and Irene Holst at the Smithsonian Choctaw Research Institute, who carried out phytolith and starch grain analysis on these sediments. And one of the curious things that resulted from this analysis was that the phytoliths of domestic cultigens that emerged were exclusively maize. There's no presence of squash or of manioc or of arrowroot, all of which were crops that were regularly consumed by pre-Hispanic populations. So this, again, tells us something important about the nature of how these fields were used. They seem to have been specialized for maize production only. And just exactly what that tells us about the situation is unclear at this point, but I think it is an important part of the package. And potentially, if this was more of a bottom-up endeavor, we might expect to find evidence of a wider range of crops, a wider range of the subsistence base that most pre-Hispanic Panamanian households would have been subsiding on. But instead, we find it specialized for maize production exclusively. Dolores also recovered phytoliths associated with palms, which has led her to suggest that these populations may have been managing palms in areas adjacent to the raised field system. So it's not just a maize landscape. Out of these excavations, we also recovered soil samples that we submitted for thermoluminescence dating to Jim Feathers at the Luminescence Laboratory at the University of Washington, so as to get an idea of when these fields might have been constructed. So in these images on the left, this is an image of CH1 in the ridge system at the north of Chinina. You can see that dark layer of settlement in the left-hand or lower portion of that upper photo. And this is the canal side of our trench. The other side cuts up into the ridge itself. And this dark layer is what we interpret to be, at this point, the soil that was deposited while the raised fields were in use, because they would have had a high content of organic material as that soil was being deposited. So we took a soil sample from that, and we also took a soil sample from a very similar layer at the CH3 trench in the southern part of Chinina, which again shows this very dark layer of soil with high content of organic material. During this period of time, it was also relevant that Dolores noted in her analysis that there were higher concentrations of phytoliths in the canals than in the ridges themselves, which kind of jives with what we're seeing in the sediment and the sedimentary layers here. And so these layers were were sent out for thermoluminescence dating, and they produced dates that are just slightly before the Kubita period, which is to say slightly before that period of AD 500 to 700. The overlap of these dates would put them somewhere in the preceding Tono C phase, to use the Grand Cocle chronological scheme of Central Panama, which is about AD 200 to AD 500. So I think there's still some a bit of uncertainty to get it, or there's still some evaluation needed to understand just when different sections of these raised field systems were constructed, but there is some indication that they may have been constructed longer than or earlier than previously thought. And this again has implications for how we interpret their use. If social organization in Eastern Panama during the period of AD 200 to 500 was similar to that of Central Panama, then this was a time of very low population densities, very small local communities. In Central Panama, most people were living in isolated farmsteads and small hamlets during this time. We see nothing in the way of economic specialization or status distinction during this period of time. So again, if this is true, this might suggest more kind of a bottom-up approach or to race field agriculture, at least at the onset. Potentially, it was co-opted by political elites later, maybe not. This is something we have yet to kind of confirm through our evaluations. As I mentioned, we're also mapping these race field systems using an aerial drone in hopes to get a higher resolution imagery of the landscape so as to hopefully detect more than what we can see just in satellite imagery. This is a segment of the project that is being directed by Annie Lopez. She is our drone pilot and is in charge of all the image processing of this. And a section of what we have produced so far with these images is there on the left. This shows the settlement of Chinina, and actually this is our field house right here where we live while we're in the Lower Bayano Valley. And you can see just the high amount of detail that we're gaining from some of these images. The parameters of the flights are shown over there on the right. And here, just for a point of comparison, is that same segment of landscape shown in the Google Earth imagery. So you can see we're getting much higher resolution data out of these drone images, which was the point of doing it. We opted to use drone images and to see what we can do with image processing to create a digital elevation model based on those images, as opposed to LiDAR imagery, simply because drone imagery is more cost effective. We understand that we're probably giving up a good deal of resolution and detail in that mapping, but we think, or we're optimistic that what we'll be able to generate is sufficient to really produce a detailed map of the area across which these landscape modifications were built. Okay. And finally, when we look at the distribution of sherd densities among the regional collection lots that were documented during regional survey, we can identify 3 zones that across which sherd densities were consistently high. These are not collection lots where we just might have happened to throw a shovel probe down on a particularly and unusually high density area like a midden or something. These are areas across which high densities are sustained across relatively large areas. At Corozal West, those red collection lots in this image correspond to an area of about 9 to 10 hectares. At Corozal Central, an area of about 4 to 5 hectares. And at Chinina, an area of about 6 to 7 hectares. And so these areas were subject to more intensive testing, using 1 by 1 meter test pits, excavated at intervals no larger than 50 meters. And we're hoping to kind of decrease that interval as we carry out more work so as to get a higher grade resolution of the different types of activities that will be carried out across these communities. And some of the questions we hope to address with this phase of work are enumerated there on the slide. We want to understand how status objects were distributed across these areas of occupation, and does that distribution suggest any status distinctions that might suggest sociopolitical inequalities and potentially more kind of top-down efforts of race field agriculture. How were non-local objects distributed among these communities or among households within these communities? Was that distribution of non-local objects relatively even, or again, does it show relatively restricted distribution that might suggest differential access to non-local goods? And how were productive activities distributed among households within these communities as well? Is that distribution such that it would suggest productive differentiation or economic specialization of some sort? And so here we are looking again at that high density area in Corozal West, with the same kind of color coding that we saw at the regional scale. If we remove those high density collection lots from the image, we see two kind of linear landscape features that are indicated by that lower or lighter shading of brown here. And these are indeed two what we think are modified platforms that were used for residential living. So these we think are modifications of the landscape that were not agricultural, but that were built to elevate people's houses above what is otherwise often inundated terrain. And so on this image at the left, we are at the eastern edge of the settlement looking west down the northern platform. In the image on the right, we are at the eastern edge of the settlement looking west with the northern platform on our right and the inundated kind of low-lying zone between the platforms in between. And you can see some of the areas where water collects there during the rainy season, making it undesirable for human occupation. So here's the distribution of test pits that we have excavated at Corozal West so far, the majority of them falling along these two occupational ridges, although we did excavate others in the more low-lying, somewhat inundated zones, just so as to have artifact assemblages that we can compare with those recovered from the elevated ridges. And as the shear density map of these test pits shows, indeed, the high density areas were concentrated on these ridges. And we can identify three high density sectors of Corozal West where three contiguous test pits occur, each of which has a shear density approaching or over 1,000 sherds per square meter. So these seem to be particularly interesting areas that we hope to return to carry out more testing so as to get better samples, better household artifact assemblage samples, so that we can begin to look at differences in household assemblages in those areas, and then also compare them with household assemblages outside those areas as well. We also identified what may be a potentially high status sector at this part of the settlement, highlighted there in the white polygon or in the white shaded polygon. From one of these test pits, we recovered, and these are just general impressions based on what we saw coming out of the ground at this point. We have not carried out the materials analysis, so I'll ask that you not hold me to these conclusions too strongly. But based on our general impressions, the test pit on the right in that high status sector seems to have generated the highest frequency of decorated sherds. It generated a high frequency of high quality chert, and it generated what is the only kind of ornament that has been recovered in our excavation so far in the form of a greenstone bead. And so this is beginning to suggest an area of high status settlement in this particular part of the community at Corozal West. We have not completed carrying out the intensive testing at Corozal Central or Chinina yet. We are in the process of doing that. We've excavated about 12 1 by 1 meter test pits at each of these settlements, so I don't have density maps or anything very meaningful to say about these locations yet. But again, Corozal Central stands out as being particularly interesting to us, not just because of the high density of occupation that seems to have been located there, but also, again, because this is where we find that really high concentration of shell middens there. So we want to understand what's been going on in relation to these shell middens. Thus far, our excavations have been focused on excavating test pits explicitly outside of these shell midden contexts so as to get household artifact assemblages outside of these shell middens. And then, of course, we will be returning in the dry season to excavate test pits within the shell middens themselves so as to get samples of artifacts from those middens. But like I said, in the dry season at a time when we can leave those excavations open overnight without them flooding to the rim in the course of a day, which is usually what happens when during the rainy season during our summer months. And then finally, at Chinina, we have excavated 12 test pits as well. And one interesting thing to have come out of the test pits so far at Chinina is that from 3 test pits out of a total of 72 that have been excavated so far in the region, 3 test pits of Chinina are the only ones that have generated spindle whorls or evidence of textile production. And they're all 3 sequential test pits along in a kind of a linear trajectory, one right next to the other. And so this suggests maybe some productive differentiation in textile production that seems to have been more concentrated at this sector of Chinina. And again, no evidence, again, based on our recollection of spindle whorls coming out of any of our other test pits in the region. So again, this is speaking to some degree of economic differentiation. So where does this leave us at this point? Going back to some of our original questions, where did people live and carry out different activities in the Lower Bayano Valley, particularly in relation to the raised field systems? We can say at this point, based on current evidence, that settlement was strongly concentrated in the coastal lowlands, seemingly by choice, not by necessity. Today, the vast majority of the modern population in the Lower Bayano region lives in these uplands in the hills with only a single community, the community of Chinina itself, which is composed of about maybe 30 to 50 households. That is the only population that lives down in the coastal lowlands. So this is a strike contrast to what we see in the pre-Hispanic era. The densest areas of settlement are located directly adjacent to raised fields. Some stages of lithic reduction seem to have been carried out in the hills behind Pai and Corozal, and shell processing, be it for subsistence or craft, seems to have been concentrated at Corozal Central. As for the question of were all landscape modifications of the Lower Bayano Valley purely agricultural in nature, it seems no. There are at least some modifications that seem to have been purely residential in nature, and then others, such as that at Pai and maybe in the southern part of Chinina, that seem to have been a mix, where you might have had large modified platforms atop which people built their residences, but also may have had some fields in the immediately surrounding landscape. What kinds of crops were raised fields used to cultivate? At this point, we can say, based on current evidence, exclusively maize, at least in Chinina. We have yet to carry out botanical analyses of any of the modifications at Pai or Corozal. And then how were status objects, non-local objects, and productive activities distributed among households within these communities? We have tentative evidence to suggest that there was status and productive differentiation in some of these communities at in this region, as well as differential access to non-local goods. Again, based on general impressions, it does seem like Corozal West as a community seemed to have had a higher frequency of non-local sherds, specifically Grand Cocle sherds of that polychrome variety. So what comes next? In the immediate future, what we're going to do is expand the regional survey zone to include more of the uplands areas. We will complete the intensive testing at Corozal Central and Chinina so as to get a better idea of how artifacts were distributed across those settlements. Complete the drone mapping and image processing with the hopes of producing a sort of digital elevation model with which we can really accurately assess the extent of landscape modifications in the Lower Bayano Valley. We have yet to carry out the ceramics analysis and other materials analyses, which we will be starting this coming summer. And this includes some thermoluminescence dating of sherds. The ceramic chronology of Eastern Panama is not as developed as it is in Central Panama. And like in Central Panama, it is based largely on ceramic form and decoration, meaning that the vast majority of just body sherds that we recover cannot be assigned to specific chronological periods. So we're going to be working to develop a ceramic chronology that we can use to assign those normal body sherds to specific periods. And then some specific lines of research that is going to be carried out is being led by our colleague Sergio Castro, is excavating additional shell middens. We have excavated one so far at Corozal Central and another at Marchena, so as to obtain artifact assemblages out of those middens. And Sergio also intends to do some isotope analysis on some of the shells to get an idea of climatic conditions at different points in time, and then also analyze soil samples with the hopes of giving us an understanding of how this beachfront and these coastal lowlands form, because it's clear that it is and was in the past a very dynamic landscape, and getting a grip of how that landscape formed is going to be an important part of understanding what was going on. And so Sergio is going to be leading that charge of the investigation. And then lots more. We want to understand how Miraflores fits into this, but that's a project for the future. We want to understand how some of the coastal lowlands on the other side of the Rio Bayano fit into this. That's another question for the future. As of now, there's no indication in satellite imagery that there were raised fields in this part of the region, but it's some more investigation is called for to really confirm that. So I do want to take the opportunity to thank Richard Cook, a dear friend and colleague of so many of us, who passed away a couple of weeks ago. Richard was a just huge source of help and support, both in this project and throughout my entire career in Panama. And well, for those of us who know him, there are no words needed to express just what he meant to us, what he meant to the archaeology of Panama, and just what an incredible colleague he was, and he will be sorely missed. I would also like to thank some of Richard's colleagues at STRI, Ashley Sharp and Nicole Smith-Guzman, who throughout all stages of this research have been incredibly generous with their time and their resources in making sure we have what we need to successfully carry out our work. And we would also like to thank Juan Martin of the Universidad del Norte, as it was him who gave Annie and me our initial opportunity to start working in this region. And for that, we are extremely grateful. We would also like to thank the local communities with whom we live and work among while we are in the field, the communities specifically of Chinina, Tranca, Martinambo, and Torrin, with special calls out to the families of Alfredo Rivas, Alejandro Diaz, Angel Ortega, Jorge Valencia, and Leonardo Acosta. In addition to the research component of this project, just the social interactions and the lives that we have built there with these people has been truly amazing. And we are truly indebted to these people for taking us in as members of their community and in some cases, members of their family. And we have been very fortunate enough to have been joined by over 20 undergraduate and graduate students so far in this project who have participated in different stages of this field research. These students have been drawn from 5 different universities from across three different countries. Working with the students, and I think I speak for the rest of my team on this, has been just an immense pleasure. It is a true joy, frustrating at times, of course, but a real joy to work with these students, and they have made an invaluable contribution to the success of this project as well. And we would like to thank the institutions whose insignia you see located here, the National Science Foundation, the University of Hawaii at Manoa, Sacramento State, and the Ministerio de Cultura of Panama for their financial and administrative support, without which this work would not be possible. And I would like to thank you all for coming and listening to this talk today. There's my email address if anybody has questions that they would like to send me at a later date. And I will leave these references up there for anybody to peruse if they would like to. So thank you very much, everyone. And if there is time, Patricia, I would be more than happy to take any questions or comments that people might have.
Yes, thank you very much, Adam. Thank you for your talk. Yes, now we open the opportunity for our audience to make questions or comments wherever they want. So let's see if there is any questions in the Facebook. Lindsay, can you help me if there is any questions in Facebook? Okay. Okay, while Lindsay could search in the Facebook, I'm going to start to ask a question. Yeah, I would like to know, in terms of the phytolith analysis, if you have, it's clear that it's a majority of maize or monocultive maize, but have you been through some other kinds of microrest, as for example starches, not only phytoliths, that other kind of another kind of microrest that could maybe suggest another kind of or more detail with another crops?
Right. I know that in their analysis, Dolores and Irene did carry out starch grain analysis and really did not find anything in the way of starches. And she attributed that to what is typically poor preservation of starches in general. And specifically I'm not sure if the soil conditions of Panama, the very acidic soils of that part of the world, have to affect that preservation more so. But starch grains were sought after, but none were found. And as of now, only phytolith and starch grain analysis have been carried out, although I do think, at least in passing, Dolores has mentioned some interest in pursuing other types of analyses. And we certainly hope to carry out botanical analyses of the modifications at Corozal West specifically, and also at Pi, which might show some additional variation that might be interesting. So.
Okay, great. Thank you.
We don't have any questions yet in the Facebook Live chat, but I have a question actually, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I was curious about the ceramic concentration that you're in association with some of the raised fields. And I was just wondering kind of what forms are you kind of having more dominant, whether or not there tend to be kind of more cooking or serving vessel forms and whatnot, and just kind of wondering about that.
That is to be determined. We are going to start the ceramic analysis this coming summer. And so we haven't sat down and shuffled through the sherds and started identifying forms and types, but that will be a very kind of key element in assessing their use and kind of their role within the broader landscape. But we'll be looking at different forms. And then I think some of that could be useful in determining whether to what degree they might have served a residential function in some areas versus an agricultural one in others. And another line of evidence that doesn't relate to the ceramic assemblage, but that Dolores has suggested, is that looking for different types of remains coming from different types of the plant in different areas of the landscape modifications might help us elucidate whether these areas were residential or agricultural, because we might expect different types of plant remains to be predominant in those two different contexts. But as far as ceramic forms, I'm sorry to say that I don't have any information for you at this point.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much. I was just curious also, because you mentioned the carbonized kind of food crust on one of the ceramics used in dating. And I'm excited to see what you guys find in association with these fields. It's really interesting. So.
Yeah, excellent. So are we. Thank you.
Hello, I've got a question too. First off, I love the talk.
Thank you.
It's very interesting to see archaeology from back home. As I mentioned earlier, it's not really something that is mentioned or really taught in lower levels. And when I heard about the findings of different burial systems and burial assemblages in other sites, how does that work through with the different indigenous peoples that are still present in Panama? Like, to what extent is there like open communication, knowing that in Panama we have a couple of comarcas, having the Nobe, Bugle, Cunas of Guargandí, the Cunayala, and all of the other groups. Is there any open dialogue in a more like ethnographic point of view, I'd say?
And are you asking about in relation to the barrels that have been excavated specifically, or just in general?
Just in general.
Okay.
If that's, sorry that it's not really that.
Yeah,
specific.
Sure. Yeah. There certainly is, I think, an increasingly open communications of dialogue between archaeologists and indigenous communities. I have a friend and a colleague, Yarixa, who is from the Gunayala, mentioned to me one time that I hope I'm remembering this correctly, that Gunayala has recently established some sort of committee or board that is designed to help interact with archaeologists and other researchers that want to pursue types of research in their territory, so as to kind of foster that collaboration. There have certainly been projects that have really tried to incorporate indigenous viewpoints. And I'm going off of recollection, but I think there was a work published by Juan Martin and Tomas Mendizábal that dealt with that issue specifically in Eastern Panama. And so there certainly are those avenues of dialogue. We were very fortunate. We were joined by two members of Gunayala among the students that worked with us from the Universidad de Panama. And while they weren't there as official representatives of the comarca necessarily, it was great to have them along. And so I think that indigenous collaboration is something that is becoming more and more commonplace in Panama. And I've recently seen just some Facebook photos of some colleagues, of some Colombian colleagues who are working in Eastern Panama, who I think are now starting what seemed to be a collaborative project in some of the comarcas in Eastern Panama as well.
Thank you.
Hey, Adam, please say hi to Annie for me.
I certainly will.
Tell her to try that drone stuff in the wet season where you got like 20 centimeters of water in the ditches. Some of those things might really pop. I understand why you work in the dry season, of course.
Right.
If she can't do it, I'll do it for you when I'm down there, because I always work in the wet season.
Okay, very good.
I was going to ask about a comparison I draw between Olga Linares' old work in Cherokee and your work, and she once reasoned that people were sort of pushed offshore onto islands because of sort of population pressure on the mainland. And I realized in your survey area, you talked about low densities a bunch of times. And I'm going to just take that to mean that there's no acute evidence for population pressure within the survey zone that you've yet noted. But anecdotally speaking, because Linares never did systematic surveys in the Cherokee Plains, but if you do go around on any given day, you'll find these massive sites, right? So she's probably well aware of that too. And are you aware of any like really massive sites in a similar way further inland or up along the Bayano River?
Not that I'm aware of. There was, and I'm going to not be able to recall this individual's name. There was a purposive survey that was conducted back in the 60s or 70s, I think, by, I think at the time, an undergraduate student at the Universidad de Panama, who essentially kind of tried to document all of the known sites in the Bayano region. And it is discussed in Tomás Mendizábal's dissertation, if anybody wants to go look this up. But there were settlements documented along the Bayano Valley, or along the Bayano River, forgive me. I think the most well-known at this point, apart from what we're recovering in our survey zone, is probably the site of Miraflores, which is about 15 kilometers upriver, where Richard excavated tombs back in the 1970s. Any other settlement that we know to exist in that region, we don't have any information on how large it was, what types of artifacts have been recovered from there. We know very little other than that they existed in these regions. And one of the things that I forgot to mention during the course of my talk, but that is very important to kind of understanding how all these possible scenarios flesh out, is that at this point in time, we don't know where lots of the patterning that we can observe right now fall chronologically. So if we don't know if the emerging kind of tendencies of status differentiation and a productive differentiation correspond to the period of race field agriculture, or perhaps they don't. So working out that chronological framework will also be an important part of it. But as far as other settlements and other kind of bodies of knowledge that might suggest population pressure, it's pretty scant right now. But based on what we've surveyed in the upland so far, it's certainly not looking like that populations were so heavy up there that people wouldn't have been able to sustain themselves.
And then I guess a follow-up question on the population front is carrying capacity estimates. You know, I look at those areas, it seems like they're devoted to ranching rather than farming. Is that correct?
Yes, the vast majority, like in most parts of Panama, I think the vast majority of the landscape is devoted to cattle ranching, with only very small plots of field used for largely maize cultivation in the Bayano Valley. I'm trying to think. There may be some instances of rice cultivation in certain parts, but again, at a very small scale. And at least the modern maize plots that I know of are to generate feed for cattle. It's not for domestic consumption and for household consumption. It's not used to sell in the market. It's used to feed cattle.
I'm just curious, and this is just a off the cuff answer I'm looking for, is with the race fields I'm familiar with, sometimes they could pull off 2 harvests a year,
right, with
maize specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be dramatically different than what it might be otherwise, minus the raised fields. Mm-hmm. I'm just kind of curious, how much do you think subsistence might have been enhanced, or agricultural production might have been enhanced by the addition of these raised fields?
I think it's a bit unclear, because there have been studies that have evaluated kind of the efficiency, the productive efficiency of raised field, and some studies ultimately coming to show that they might not have been as kind of productive as people once thought. And I'm thinking specifically about a study done by Matt Bandy and maybe some others in the Titicaca Basin. But I think the possibility that they would have been able to get 2 harvests out of it, I think is a very plausible possibility. There is an interesting anecdote from the ethnohistoric documents in Eastern Panama. There's not a lot of attention given to certain aspects of life in the ethnohistoric documents. And so when the chronicler, or when the Spanish did mention these kind of otherwise not often discussed parts of life. They kind of stand out. And one of the things they talked about in Eastern Panama was the capacity, I think talking specifically about the Berrey chiefdom, which is further east towards the Colombian border, but the ability to produce 2 harvests per year. They explicitly make that observation in the context of the Berrey chiefdom, which exists within Eastern Panama, not terribly far from the Bayano Valley. Now, whether there's any evidence of landscape modification in that region, we have no idea at this point. But it was an interesting just kind of anecdote that was associated with agricultural production in that context. And so I think 2 harvests a year would have been feasible given in those raised field systems. Whether more than that was possible, it's hard to say.
Can I ask one? Yeah, Adam.
I do.
You have several modest to moderate sized patches of raised fields scattered along the coastal plain. Do you have any kind of seat of the pants feeling about whether those 3 patches are identifiably in particularly propitious zones for that sort of treatment? Or are they just kind of, like in some sense, randomly selected patches in a much larger zone where much more extensive raised fields could be built in the same way?
Based on our assessment right now, they really do seem to be located in more or less random patches. There's nothing that seems particularly favorable about the areas at Corozal or at Pai or at Chinina, where these really clear raised fields, the most conspicuous ones in satellite imagery, appear. There's nothing particularly noteworthy of those areas to suggest, oh, it makes sense that they would have built raised fields here. It seems that they could have done so in almost any part of the coastal lowlands.
Thanks.
Okay, I don't know if someone has new questions, another questions or comments. If not, maybe we thanks Adam for his talk. And yeah, thank you everybody for being here with us. And we expect you to connect to our next webinars. And thanks to all.